For 8 years, she waved to him every morning. Sometimes he'd help carry her groceries. Other times he'd ask about her kids or offer a neighborly smile when their paths crossed. He was the man next door, quiet, polite, and, in her mind, harmless. She never wondered why he kept his curtains drawn all day. She never thought twice when he'd disappear for days at a time, because why would she? He was just the neighbor. But on one unremarkable Tuesday morning, everything she thought she knew shattered. She would soon learn that she hadn't been living next to a friendly stranger. She'd been living next to a murderer, and for nearly a decade, she had no idea. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of her upcoming videos. She still remembers the moment she first saw the police cars, 3 of them, lining the narrow street in front of her home. The sound of radios crackling, the heavy boots pounding against asphalt, the low hum of voices that didn't sound casual at all. She stood on her porch, clutching her morning coffee, feeling the warmth against her hands as the air around her seemed to grow colder. At first, she thought maybe there'd been a robbery or an accident, but then she saw them, officers walking toward her neighbor's door, hands resting on holstered weapons, eyes sharp. And for the first time in 8 years, she realized she had no idea who the man next door really was.
The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in muted shades of gray. She stepped out onto her porch the way she always did, coffee in hand, robe tied loosely around her waist. The street was quiet, except for the low rumble of a garbage truck in the distance. She liked mornings like this, slow, uneventful, predictable. But that morning, something felt different. It started with the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Not one car, but several. She glanced up and froze. 3 police cruisers turned into the street one after another, their headlights cutting through the dim light. No sirens, no blaring horns, just a steady approach that made her pulse quicken. She watched as uniformed officers stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement with sharp, deliberate steps. They didn't glance around, didn't exchange casual chatter. Their focus was locked ahead, on the house right next to hers. She gripped her coffee tighter, feeling the heat sear her palms. Questions swirled in her mind. Had there been a break-in, a family emergency? But the way the officers moved, steady, direct, made it clear this wasn't a routine visit. She had lived next door to that man for 8 years. 8 years of borrowed sugar, quick waves, and polite conversation. She knew his name, she knew the sound of his laugh, but standing there on her porch, watching the police close in on his front door, she realized there was a lot she didn't know. The first knock wasn't loud, just firm enough to make the wood vibrate in its frame. The second was harder, sharper, echoing across the still morning air. She held her breath without meaning to. From her porch, she could see his curtain shift, just a fraction, as if someone inside was deciding whether or not to look out. The officers didn't wait long. One stepped to the side, hand resting on the grip of his holster. Another stayed squarely in front of the door, his stance wide and ready. The door opened halfway. Her neighbor's face appeared in the gap. Hair tousled, eyes narrow as if the light outside stung. They spoke in low voices, words she couldn't catch. She only caught pieces like, "Step outside, need to ask you, right now." His gaze flicked briefly toward her house, and for a moment she thought she saw something off. Not panic, not fear, but calculation. The officers guided him out onto the porch. No cuffs yet, no raised voices, but their eyes stayed locked on him, and their hands never drifted far from their belts. She tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had. Maybe it was last summer when he'd offered her some tomatoes from his garden. Maybe it was the fall before that when she had lent him a ladder. All those memories felt suddenly hollow, as if each one had been hiding something she should have seen. They led him to the front steps and had him sit down, one officer standing just behind his shoulder. Another officer reached into his vest, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and read aloud the warrant. The words floated through the still air, formal and deliberate, and she felt her chest tighten even though they weren't meant for her. When they crossed the threshold, she caught a glimpse inside. Stacks of newspapers leaning against the wall, a hallway light flickering weakly. For years, she had imagined his place as neat and ordinary, the kind of home where you could smell coffee in the morning and hear the hum of the TV in the evening. But this was different. The first officer disappeared down the hall, while the second began opening drawers in the small living room, slipping objects into labeled evidence bags. A box of old photographs, a pair of gloves, and a heavy flashlight with worn edges. Minutes passed, the neighborhood strangely quiet except for the sound of boots on creaky floors. She stood frozen at her own window, her coffee going cold in her hand. Then she saw it. One officer emerging from the back room holding a small, sealed container, his expression unreadable. He handed it off quickly to another who tucked it into a larger bag and whispered something she couldn't hear. Her mind raced through years of moments, the way he always parked in the far corner of his driveway, the night she saw his porch light flick on long after midnight, the way he sometimes paused mid-conversation as if distracted by something only he could hear. And then she realized they weren't leaving anytime soon.
The search had been going on for nearly an hour when the first shout came from the back bedroom. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air in a way that made every officer in the house pause. One of them called for the lead detective, who moved quickly down the hallway, his hand brushing the edge of the wall as he passed. She could only see parts of what was happening from her kitchen window, glimpses of officers moving in and out of a room, their voices low but urgent. Then, a long cardboard box was carried out. The officer holding it didn't speak, but his face was set in a tight, fixed expression. He walked straight to a marked SUV and placed it inside without breaking stride. Moments later, 2 more items followed, a battered duffel bag and what looked like a stack of old binders. The duffel sagged heavily, its zipper partially open, just enough for her to see the corner of something wrapped in plastic. She stepped back instinctively, her breath catching. The sound of the neighborhood faded from her mind. All she could focus on was the image of that bag and the sudden, heavy truth pressing in. Whatever was in there was the reason the officers had come, and it wasn't going to be something you could explain away. By that evening, the street felt different. Cars slowed as they passed, and people who normally waved or chatted on their front lawns now stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. The blue and red lights from earlier were gone, but their memories seemed to hang in the air. On the porch next door, a man in his 60s leaned against the railing, talking quietly to a woman holding a mug of coffee. He kept glancing toward the house where the search had taken place, his brow furrowed. "I knew something was off, just didn't think it was this," he muttered. Others shared pieces of their own observations. Strange smell last summer, boxes being moved late at night, arguments overheard through thin walls. Each story added another layer to the growing unease. Inside her own home, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. She thought about the man who had lived just a few steps away for 8 years, the same man who had carried groceries for her when her arm was in a sling, who had watered her plants while she was out of town. She tried to match that memory with what she'd seen today, but the 2 versions didn't fit. The more she thought about it, the more one question refused to leave her mind. How close had she really been to danger all this time? The following morning, the street woke to the sound of heavy boots on pavement and low voices speaking into radios. A black SUV from the county crime unit pulled up in front of the house, its doors opening in near unison. The air felt heavy,
even though the sky was bright and cloudless. Neighbors peered through blinds or from half-closed curtains as investigators carried large, sealed boxes inside. A few minutes later, one of them emerged, holding something small and wrapped in a clear evidence bag. From a distance, it looked unremarkable, just a folded piece of paper. But the expression on the officer's face as he handed it to his partner made it clear this wasn't nothing. Hours passed. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, kids playing in driveways, were absent. Then, just after noon, the front door opened again. This time, 2 detectives carried out a large covered container. They loaded it carefully into the back of the SUV before disappearing inside once more. From her kitchen window, she watched the scene with her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The logical part of her brain told her to look away, but she couldn't. She thought about the laughter she'd heard from that house over the years, the sound of music during summer barbecues. When the official report came out later that week, she would learn exactly what those containers held, and it would change how she looked at her home, her street, and her neighbors forever. The man everyone thought they knew had never truly existed. His real name wasn't the one printed on his mailbox, and the smiling photos he shared at block parties had been taken hundreds of miles away long before he moved here. Through official records and old newspaper archives, investigators pieced together a timeline that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. 8 years ago, in a quiet town 2 states over, a young woman had gone missing after leaving work. Her case had gone cold, the file gathering dust in a county evidence room, until fingerprints found in that small folded paper connected it to the man next door. The more they uncovered, the more disturbing it became. He had changed his name, altered his appearance slightly, and built a completely new life. He attended church picnics, coached a kids' baseball team, and offered to help elderly neighbors carry groceries. No one suspected a thing. For her, the hardest part was realizing how close she had been, sharing casual conversations at the mailbox, waving as he mowed his lawn, even lending him a ladder once. In hindsight, small moments now carried a weight she couldn't shake. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you'd never miss any of our upcoming videos.
It was just after midnight when the first flashing lights reflected off her bedroom wall. At first, she thought it was an accident on the main road, but the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement outside told her this was happening much closer. She peeked through the blinds, her hands trembling, before she even knew why. Multiple officers moved quickly toward his driveway, their voices low but urgent. One of them carried a crowbar. Another had his hand on his holster. The air felt tense, as though everyone knew something life-changing was about to happen. She watched as they pounded on his door. No answer. Then came the crash, wood splintering, footsteps rushing inside, and the faint sound of drawers being pulled open. Minutes later, they led him in handcuffs. His head was lowered, but when he glanced up for a split second, their eyes met. It was a look she would never forget. In that moment, she realized she'd been living beside a man whose secrets had finally got up to him. And somewhere deep down, she knew the story was far from over. At the station, hours passed before he spoke. Detectives sat across from him, silent, letting the weight of the situation settle in. He avoided their eyes, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. The room was thick with unspoken questions. When he finally opened his mouth, it wasn't an outright confession. It was fragments. A slip here, a detail there, but each piece was enough to guide them toward a truth they had only suspected. They brought in boxes from his home, filled with items that seemed ordinary at first glance. But inside those boxes were clues that would shatter the quiet neighborhood's sense of safety. Neighbors who had once waved at him from their driveways were now gathered in hushed circles, replaying every past interaction. She sat alone in her kitchen,
the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud, thinking back to the countless times she'd passed him in the hallway or heard his footsteps late at night. Every sound now carried a different meaning. The investigation had shifted from suspicion to certainty, and she couldn't help but wonder how much of it had she ignored. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Word spread faster than anyone expected. By the afternoon, the entire block seemed to know, though few dared to speak about it openly. Some avoided eye contact entirely, while others stood in their yards, arms crossed, staring toward his house as if expectant to reveal its secrets. Old memories began to resurface. The time he refused to join a neighborhood barbecue, the way he always shut his curtains before sunset, the strange noise someone once heard in the middle of the night. None of it seemed important back then. Now, every detail felt like a missed warning. She received messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered comfort, others wanted to know every detail she'd seen or heard. It wasn't just curiosity, it was disbelief, mixed with the unsettling realization that someone capable of unthinkable things had been living right among them. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the street was quieter than usual. No children played outside, and the usual chatter between neighbors was gone. The air carried a heaviness that made even casual conversation feel impossible. When investigators returned the next morning, they came prepared with a warrant and a clear plan. The front door opened with a dull creak, and the house seemed almost too still, as if it had been holding its breath for years. They moved carefully, documenting every inch, until one officer noticed something strange about the far wall of the basement. The paint looked fresher there, slightly brighter than the rest. A light tap revealed a hollow sound. Behind a shelf stacked with old boxes, they found a narrow wooden panel, its edges barely visible. With a careful pull, it swung open to reveal a cramped passage. Inside was a small, windowless room. The walls were bare concrete, the floor covered with a worn rug. In the center sat a single chair, a small table, and an old tape recorder. Folders were stacked neatly in one corner, each labeled with dates that stretched back almost a decade. It was the kind of discovery that made everyone stop speaking. Whatever story had been hidden here, it was finally about to be told.
The air in the small room felt heavy, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of what had happened there. An officer knelt beside the stack of folders, slipping on gloves before opening the first one. Inside were photographs, some faded, others crisp, each showing a different person. Notes were scribbled in the margins, describing names, ages, and dates. Beside the folder sat the old tape recorder. One detective pressed play, and a faint hiss filled the room before a man's voice broke through. It was calm, almost casual, as he spoke about his daily life, but then shifted into descriptions of watching neighbors, following strangers, and keeping track of them. The recordings matched the dates on the files. It was clear that this had been going on for years. Every entry, every voice memo, every picture, a meticulous record of people who had no idea they were being observed. One of the officers looked at the others, his expression tightening. He wasn't just planning, he was studying. Sarah sat in the small interview room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Across from her, Detective Harris laid a single photograph on the table. She stared at it for a moment, not understanding, until she recognized the angle. It was taken from her own kitchen window, looking straight into her living room. Her breath caught. The detective placed another photo down, and another. Each one was of her, carrying groceries, reading by the window, laughing with a friend, all of them taken without her knowledge. She trembled. How long?
The detective didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid a folder toward her. "We believe at least 8 years." She looked down at the images, her mind reeling. Every ordinary day she had lived, every quiet moment, every walk to her car, all watched, documented, and filed away by the man who lived next door. When the news finally broke, it spread across town faster than anyone could have imagined. Neighbors stood in small groups outside their homes, speaking in hushed tones, glancing toward the quiet street where Olivia still lived. Many had known her for years. She was the friendly neighbor who watered plants when people went on vacation, who baked cookies for the block's annual holiday gathering. The thought that someone could live right beside her, hiding such a disturbing obsession for nearly a decade, sent a shiver through everyone's spine. Parents clutched their children closer, wondering how many other secrets might be hidden behind their own fences. At the local diner, conversations were filled with questions no one could answer. How would no one noticed? Could this happen again? And most haunting of all, what might have happened if the police hadn't stepped in when they did? The man at the center of it all had always kept to himself. He worked odd hours, rarely spoke to neighbors, and never seemed to have visitors. People described him as polite but distant, someone you could greet with a nod but never really get to know. His yard was always trimmed, his bills always paid on time, and there was nothing about his routine that would have raised suspicion. But investigators were now piecing together a far different picture. Inside his small, dimly lit home, they found meticulous records, notes, photographs, and objects that no ordinary person would keep. Everything was arranged with unsettling precision, as if he had been preparing for something or keeping track of events no one else knew about. The quiet, unassuming man the town thought they knew had been living a double life, and the truth about what he had done was far worse than anyone could have imagined.
When investigators stepped deeper into the man's home, the air felt heavy, stale, as though it hadn't been opened to the outside world in years. The curtains were drawn tight, letting in only thin streaks of light that fell across stacks of cardboard boxes lining the walls. Each box was labeled with dates, sometimes stretching back years, and inside were items that didn't seem to belong to him at all. Wallets, keys, scraps of clothing, and old photographs of people no one in the neighborhood recognized. There was a locked drawer in the bedroom, and inside it, police found a set of journals. Every page was filled with small, precise handwriting, daily entries recording movements, conversations, even the weather. But mixed in with these everyday notes were disturbing observations about strangers, written with the same steady tone as if he were recording a grocery list. The further they looked, the more it became clear. This man had been quietly documenting lives, and some of those lives had simply disappeared. At the precinct, the journals were laid out across a long table, each one tagged and numbered. Detectives began cross-referencing the dates and descriptions with old case files. At first, the similarities could have been coincidence, a name here, a location there, but as the hours went on, the pattern became undeniable. One entry mentioned a young woman last seen leaving a grocery store on a Tuesday evening. Another described a man walking his dog along a quiet stretch of road, right down to the color of the leash. Both individuals had been reported missing within days of those notes being written. The more they checked, the longer the list grew. It was as though the man had been keeping a private record of people who would later vanish, and no one had realized it until now. When the man was brought into the small interview room, he appeared calm, almost detached. The detectives slid the stack of journals across the table, their pages already marked with sticky notes and evidence tags. We've matched these entries to actual missing persons cases. Some go back years. You knew these people before they disappeared. The man glanced at the pile without touching it, his eyes giving away nothing. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, instead of answering the question, he asked for a glass of water. Detectives exchanged a look, not one of surprise, but of recognition. They had seen this tactic before: stall, redirect, avoid. But this time the evidence was too precise to ignore.
The room grew heavier with the weight of unanswered questions. The detectives pressed him again, this time pointing to a specific journal entry from 8 years ago. It described a woman with striking red hair, the same description given in a missing persons case from that year. You wrote about her walking her dog every morning at exactly 6:15. You even described the kind of leash she used. How would you know that? For the first time, his composure shifted. His lips tightened and his eyes darted briefly toward the camera in the corner of the room. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough for the detectives to know they had touched a nerve. He opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. That pause, that hesitation spoke louder than words. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The search warrant for his home led officers to a cluttered garage, packed with old furniture, boxes, and tools. Buried beneath the stack of dusty moving cartons, they found one box sealed with layers of duct tape. It was heavier than it looked, and the moment it was lifted onto the workbench, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Inside, there were neatly folded clothes, a pair of women's shoes, and an envelope containing photographs. The faces in those pictures matched 3 unsolved missing persons cases from different years. The precision with which each item had been stored made the detectives uneasy. Nothing in that box was random. It was deliberate. And with each discovery, the distance between suspicion and certainty grew smaller.
For years, the man everyone knew as Daniel Reeves maintained the image of a quiet, dependable neighbor. But when the truth finally emerged, prosecutors revealed that Reeves had taken the lives of 5 people over a span of 8 years. Each victim, investigators claimed, was connected to him in some way: a tenant, a casual acquaintance, or someone who had simply crossed his path at the wrong time. In court, Reeves sat motionless as the prosecution laid out the evidence. Photographs, witness testimonies, a timeline so precise it was almost unbearable to hear. Families of the victims filled the gallery, some unable to contain their grief, others clutching photographs of their loved ones, as if holding on could somehow bring them back. The defense argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, but the weight of the testimonies was undeniable. Every detail painted the portrait of a man who had lived a double life, one face for the world and another that no one was supposed to see. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. For the families, it was justice, but not closure. For those who had lived near Reeves, it was a shock that still felt impossible to process. And now, I'll leave you with this. Do you know your neighbor next door? Have you ever noticed anything unusual about them? What would you do if you found out someone you see every day was hiding something unthinkable? Tell us in the comments below. Before we continue with more stories like this, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.